Okay, so a bit of a preamble to this. I know it's been a minute since I've put up a review, but it's specifically because I was working on this game and it took way longer than I expected. I was really kind of committed to this game because, well, I got to rent it many years ago when Blockbuster was a thing, didn't get to beat it then, and for a variety of reasons didn't get to beat it until, now. And when I had the opportunity to play it and do a review on it, I was like, yeah, this is the chance. And then it just kind of spiraled on me. Mostly because I got distracted and that took away from gaming time and that was on me. But here we go. I'm not gone. Welcome to Voodoo Whiskey Gaming, and this is my late review of Ark the Lad, Twilight of the Spirits. I play it on the PS5 because it's downloadable on the PS5, and if you still have a PS2 and the game, you could play it there, but it's also available on the PS4 as well. So let's get into the story. You play as both Dark and Karg. They are two very different dudes living very different lives in very different parts of the world. Karg is raised by humans and he is trying to better humanity. He is technically royalty, although I guess the kingdom he was a part of was destroyed, but the people he lives with still treat him like he's royalty. Whereas Dark is being raised by the Deimos, which, as you could probably guess by their name, they're kind of monsterish creatures, but they're more advanced than monsters. They have proper society, sort of. But because he doesn't look like them and he's clearly some kind of weird half-breed, they treat him terribly. Through a variety of events, they both start kind of rising in power and going on grand adventures, which, in the case of Karg, he is trying to stop the evil Darkham, who is this dictator who's basically trying to take over all the human world and do bad things. Whereas Dark is trying to elevate the Deimos and wipe out all of the humans. And I gotta say, I really didn't like either of the main characters. I mean, Karg is at times more tolerable, and Dark has his tolerable moments, but overall, they can be very difficult to tolerate and deal with, and the twists and turns along the way in this story, there's not many of them. There's like one really good one. The story itself is fine, it gets you through it, but honestly, I didn't feel as engaged in the story as I would like, especially in about the second half of the game, which is interesting because I didn't get to the second half of the game the first time I played. And while there are cool characters with their own stories, and I do like some of the stories, I think the characters in many ways were stronger than the overall story. Now let's move on to the audio, and the first thing I'm going to say is the music is good and it works, but it's nothing that's going to stand out to me in the long run. There's nothing that hits the way you want it to really enjoy and love the music. Not that it's bad by any stretch. Then you have the voiceover work, and this did come out on the PS2 originally, so there is a bit of slack there, but it really ranges from like really cheesy to occasionally bad to decent. Never really hits the good or great mark. Then you have the sound effects, which they're fine. They are very dated and they sound very dated and old, but they do work for the combat, for the running around, for just everything in general. And I was actually impressed with a few smaller sound effects, like some of the ambient noises I thought they did a good job with, as well as the footsteps. What I mean by that is when you are walking on different surfaces, you actually have different footstep noises, and I love that. Small detail, but I do think it's important, especially back in the PS2 era. Now let's get on to the gameplay mechanics and whatnot, and this is 100% an RPG. You've got your overworld. It's not necessarily a free-roaming overworld. You bounce from point to point. The only places you can really free roam are certain areas that they allow you to for story purposes. Generally, if you land on a specific area, it'll either throw you in combat or maybe you'll just pass over it. But if you select an area where there's combat, you'll generally just go straight into combat. Not a lot of free roaming. You can free roam around the cities. They have their shops, etc. But then you have the combat, which that's a little more interesting. You get put on a combat map. You can move your characters around freely. They have set ranges, and you can do physical attacks, special abilities, or magic attacks. Humans have special abilities. Deimos have magic attacks. Karg and Dark have both because they're special that way. Although I gotta admit, I did think that was kind of a weird separation, and I didn't really love the combat. It is very slow. I wish you could speed it up or skip certain things. Whenever you do a special move or a magic attack, there's an animation before it, and I'd love to just be able to skip that animation. But also, I was a little disappointed with some of the things in the combat, like the elemental thing. I say the elemental thing because it's a thing in RPGs, you know, water or ice is strong against fire, fire, grass, blah, blah, blah. wind against this or that, etc., etc. But it didn't really work that great in this game. Like, if you use water on like a fire enemy, it'll do like slightly more damage, but not a lot. But whereas if you use fire on a fire enemy, it will grossly knock down the amount of damage you do. It just didn't balance in that way, in my opinion. I also wasn't in love with the items. You get weapon parts, you don't get new weapons, but those weapon parts are really hit or miss. Some of them really are worth the swap out, and a lot are not. And I found that true of the accessories too. Like, oh, you get 4 more attack, but you lose like 6 points from other categories. Okay, it's never really that bad, but it's bad enough that you're like, is it worth it? And often the answer, in my opinion, was no. And I gotta say, overall, the combat, while it worked well, it did start to drag on the further you got into the game. I just felt like the combat needed to be sped up somehow. But honestly, I felt that way about the whole game in about the second half. I was really committed to beating this for my journey to finally getting to beat this game, but I did reach a point where I was like, it's starting to drag on. The overall experience, and maybe that's why I was so easily distracted from the game, because it reached a point where I really felt like things were dragging on. I don't think they did anything that's necessarily bad. I think they did a lot of things that haven't aged great. Ooh, I do also need to point out lack of camera control. In the combat area, it would be great if you could rotate the camera around. Ooh, almost forgot. One interesting thing that is kind of a plus and a minus at the same time in the combat is when you defeat an enemy, they there on the spot will drop spirit stones, which will replenish your special abilities, or gold, or items. Not always, but they will drop them right there on the spot in your combat map, and you can pick them up there on the spot. But if you complete the fight without picking them up, that's all lost, and that is very annoying. One thing that is cool about that, though, is if you've used special moves or magic, you can pick up spirit stones that have been dropped and replenish yourself and be able to do more. So it is kind of a cool give and take, but it is frustrating to lose all the items when you complete a fight. Let's get on to the controls, and overall I think the controls work well. There is one cool thing you can do in combat, which is you can basically spin your character around in combat and attack in any direction you'd like to. The problem is that doesn't always work great. Sometimes it'll kind of skip an area when you're trying to target, which can be really frustrating, and you've got to kind of mess around with it. And I found at times using the D-pad was a little easier for the characters who have a much more narrow attack cone, I guess you'd call it. And even that's not great, but using the thumbstick didn't work great. As for the rest of the controls, I felt that they worked well. It was just that aiming thing that didn't necessarily work great. Now let's move on to the graphics and visuals, and it's clearly very outdated. It's a PS2 game. That being said, I do think the designs of the Deimos, not necessarily cool. Some of them were cool, some of them were, whatever, kind of goofy, and I didn't find them as, intimidating as maybe they're supposed to be. But as for the humans, I also felt that the humans had some good designs. They definitely fit, and the thing I did enjoy, though, was the design of the world. This is clearly like a far future post-apocalyptic world, because you see remnants of what is essentially our old world or a civilization along the line of ours. You see crumbled skyscrapers, you see automobiles rusting, etc., etc. Like, they're beyond haggard, they are beyond salvageable, kind of. But you get the idea that once upon a time there was a much more advanced civilization, something happened, and now they're back to this kind of civilization. I will say a more primitive one. They are figuring out energy and powering things, etc. But I did like that. I think it added to the backstory. As the title implies, there are these spirit things, Twilight of the Spirits. I gotta say, those things I assumed were going to be evil as shit, because they all look like evil little creatures. I thought that was a weird choice in design. I think some of the animations, though, are really cool. I think they did a good job with some of the special attacks. The magic spells, not so much. There are some enemies, though, where I've got to point out the animations for their walking is just so bad. It looks like a kid walking around with a giant dump in their diaper kind of thing. It's just really awkward looking, and there's several human enemies who do that throughout, and I don't know why. I just can't get over how dumb it looked. It's one of those things where you're like, who animated that and thought that was gonna be a really cool looking thing? I think the animations obviously are much better for the main characters, as they should be. It makes sense. But I do think overall the game shows its age. Fortunately, it clearly wasn't trying to be hyper realistic. That would have been a bad look. It was kind of going for, I don't know, not quite cartoon, anime, somewhere in there. And so it has aged okay, but if you're a graphics snob, you're definitely not going to be down with how this game looks, and that's fair. But let's move on to the wrap up, and I gotta say, I finally beat this game. It has taken me 20 years or some shit, and it was not worth it. It was not worth the amount of time that I sank into it. Not to say that this is a terrible game. I feel like that makes it sound like it was absolutely horrible. It just wasn't necessarily worth it for me. It took me away from doing other reviews to make sure I got through this, and as I said, it felt weak and drawn out at times, so I got distracted. I've gotta say, I don't hate it, but for me it just wasn't worth it, so it is kind of hard to recommend. If you're hard up for a game or you really like just playing older games, I would say this would be fine, but I'd also say there are better experiences out there, especially in the RPG realm. So that's what I got for it. I'm sorry it took so long. Okay, so in the comments down below, why don't you tell me, have you ever gotten to play like an old ass game that you'd been hyped for and it just didn't live up to it? Because that was this for me. As always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button. And if you like what I'm doing in general, share and subscribe. Have a good one.